All right, welcome back, Kyle. Let's dive right in, man. What's going on in the business lately?
Well, look, lots of good stuff, but I think the main thing is network is back, which it's been a while since we talked about it. But we're starting to see more projects, more customers coming in, clients coming in with network needs, but probably different than what we had seen in the past. So, um, yeah, I guess like to talk about some of that, and what are you seeing in some of those deals?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's kind of a lot of macro things that are happening that are going to affect the technology side of the network. But really, like a lot of the conversations that we're having right now are actually centered around like management of it. Faster implementation times. Like a lot of the you know concerns other than the actual access and technology or even the SD-WAN or SASE components, right? I think they're probably uh, you know a result of network topology changes, but the types of things that people are coming to us with are like, hey, can you help us with inventory management? Or they want really circuit aggregation, right? They want single points of contact, or they want spend management, or that sort of thing. And all that is really a result of this kind of network topology changes that happened over the last, really probably starting 7 years ago at this point, but accelerating from then until now, where people have implemented SASE networks or implemented SD-WAN networks, whether it's managed externally with an MSP or they've done it in house. What they ended up doing as a result of that was they ended up getting different network access types, right? Whether it was DIA, whether it was broadband, in some instances even mobility or kind of cell signal, right? Wireless backup, and we're also starting to see a lot of Starlink options now. But with that, some of the kind of second and third order effects that came were you ended up managing a lot of additional vendors. You ended up needing to be responsible for the inventory control, where like that was like fundamentally different when people were on MPLS networks, right? Like all of it was with the carrier. A typically one carrier, maybe two, if you had like a really robust network and had built that sort of resiliency in. But it's interesting because that now people are looking at the second and third order effects and they're like, well, it's taking a lot of my team's time to manage this, or I have downtime and I can't get it. I can't get it back up as quickly as I would like to, and so it's interesting because we're just seeing a lot of them. Like we're seeing a lot of the same type of requests come in. So I guess that's been a lot of the conversations, and I guess I should say like this is we are mostly seeing this in 50 plus location type organizations. Um, we have a couple kind of key clients that we do this for in a managed service capacity almost. 600-700 locations.
Yeah, there's there does seem to be a threshold where you need enough volume of locations to make that a complexity to where this becomes a thing, right? And to what you're saying, a lot of I think what we're seeing is not as much. Now, obviously, this is still happening across different organizations, but not as much of a technology switch from MPLS to DIA, but more of a maybe a strategy or a service level switch, right? That it's hey, I still want basically this network, this DIA and broadband and 4G backup that we've put in, but the level of service and the level of management that goes along with it is something that they're kind of re-looking at and trying to find a better solution. And oftentimes what we get into in these conversations is, just in the military, we'd say, well, like, does time have priority? Does mission have priority? Right? Because sometimes what you have is these kind of what can be conflicting or things that combat one another, for priority. And so you kind of have to have that conversation with these decision makers where, if you want a level of consolidation through, typically what would be like an aggregator, right? You can have that one place to open tickets. But what you might find is that doing new installations is slower than going, straight to the LAC. Service disruption and outages like may take longer to get communications back, and it's just physics, right? Like you're communicating to an aggregator who's communicating internally to one of their, network, their resolution teams, who then communicates across to the LEC, who then communicates down to attack, right? So like you're just creating a, latency, if you will, but human
Yeah.
latency in the process. And so, that may take longer in exchange for having that, kind of consolidated place where you can open tickets. And it's like, okay, well, which one matters more, right? Like there's certainly value to each. But as an organization, you just have to accept or plan for, okay, we want this level of consolidation, so then we need to operationally plan for, potentially longer lead times in installs or outages, or what, we can't have that. Like we need a circuit to go in the day that we move into the building. Cool. You might need to change your strategy, and you may have to take on additional pieces, or leverage a partner like Resursive to take on additional pieces um, to handle that, right? Like there's data pieces, there's all sorts of, second and third order implications that we help clients walk through as they make those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I see most technology leaders are looking for the same thing on their network, right? They want a reliable, secure network that they never hear anything about. Like that's what
Yeah.
they want, and it's a classic IT, you know, discussion and decision. Like, are we going to do this outsourced or are we going to do this insourced, right? And so, uh, especially like you essentially have carrier aggregation, which you can do with providers that are out there and like focus on that and do that all day, or you can bring it in house and you need a technology stack to do it. Most often that's a TIM, although it's worth calling out like most to TIM, technology expense management. Most TIMs are built from a financial perspective, from a bill payment, a cost allocation perspective, whereas when you're actually trying to do inventory management, typically, whether it's a network admin or whoever it is that's in house, they're actually looking at different information than what is standard in your TIM. And so,
Yeah.
like your data hygiene, your data input, like all of those sort of things are really important, right? Like even if you just, if you're not using carrier aggregation, you may have in a large company, you may have 20, 30 carriers out there, right? So like even just the information about what your IP addresses on all of those, who are the points of contact, when you have resolution, what are the SLAs involved, like all of that sort of stuff. That's data that needs to be readily accessible, and most TIMs can do it. But again, like you have to put time and intention and focus into populating that data. And
Yeah.
then you also have to have at least one person, if you're running some sort of 24/7 type operation, like it may be two, it may be three, right? It just depends on kind of what your internal SLAs are that you're looking at. And so it's classic, IT discussion. Are we trying to do this in house? Or are we trying to do it outsourced? And what are the trade offs for each of them?
No. I do think another piece that we run into, especially for, call it clients that are multi-location, with high degrees or regular degrees of whether it's churn or new locations, right? Whether they're moving a bunch of them, which happens a lot, call it like the retail space, or they're just rapidly expanding. Uh, and I think the IT folks, when we talk to them, I think they get it, but it's sometimes a communication to maybe even the ops side of the client, is what is, and it's like, hey, we know that network is a transactional thing, right? It is a commodity, um, but it's the long pole in the tent, and it needs, it seems counterintuitive, but it almost needs a seat at the table when you're talking about these new locations, when you're planning, right? Because it's something that just always goes overlooked. That says, oh well, when I moved into my house, I called up Comcast, and they came out the next day and they installed the circuit. And can I just do that with my new location? It's like, no. I mean, you're 3, 4, sometimes 6 months to a year out from that circuit being ready. And what is a very transactional product becomes a very strategic impact when it's not there when your store goes live and you can't, and you can't process whatever it is that you're doing as a business, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and so having it, hey, ops guys, like maybe IT needs a little bit more of a lead time to get the wheels turning. Hey, we need to integrate as part of the plan. What are, if this is a new construction, like there's minimum requirements that that building has to have before the ISP will even come out to do a site survey. And it's like, okay, well, have we met those? Have we planned for those in our timeline so that we're not taking this thing for granted that, yes, does seem transactional, but gets up the chain very quickly when it's not working, right? When the network is down, everybody knows about it. Um, so it
Yeah,
seems,
there's also, I mean, there's a surprising amount of expertise that goes into delivering a circuit and how to
yep,
influence and move and impact these carriers. It seems like something that should just be so much more simple than it is. Admittedly, and like I mean, I'm running a business that specializes in it, right? Like, I mean, I tend to agree it should be more simple than it is, but it is not. Every single carrier, and they're using different language, like one, so there's like translation sort of components. Their project management, especially as margins have been compressed, has gotten worse. And communication is not proactive, it's typically reactive. And so, like, you really have to stay on top of this and sit on it, which goes back to this kind of in-house versus outsourced sort of conversation. um Look, I don't know the answer going into these conversations that I have with clients. And I mean, I spend all day every day doing this. um it is really different for every single company that we go into. I mean, we know typically kind of it's going to fit one of a few models or molds, but there's real trade-offs that need to be discussed when you're making these sort of decisions. I think I picked this up from you. I think you're the one that told me this, but happiness is where expectations meet reality, right? And so, like, I've been having a lot of conversations lately with people who are unhappy coming in, right? Like, they expected something different than they got from an aggregator, or they tried to do it in house and they're looking and they're like, I'm spending a lot of money doing this, right? Like, I mean, I've got staff, I've got a Tim that I mean, I, it's maybe 10% of the time we encounter a client with a Tim that is actually well implemented. Like, it's very, very rare that
yeah,
a client has actually implemented a Tim in a comprehensive way that supports IT. Oftentimes, it may support finance, but rarely does it actually support IT, which is a shame because the tool can actually be like very impactful for them. But anyways, like, they're coming in and they're having frustration around this. Um, when they look, if they widen the aperture and look, across where their network used to be. I mean, most likely it is, more resilient now. It's absolutely less expensive. They probably have more control at the edge on how they're doing configuration and that sort of thing, around traffic prioritization, all of those pieces. So I think generally, like, very positive impacts on the type of transformation that have occurred in networking as a whole over the last few years. Um, but now you've got kind of these second and third order effects of changing it, and people are looking at, well, how do I deal with it?
yeah. When it you need a when you need the shoe that fits your foot, right? Because that's the idea that you're talking about. Like there isn't one size fits all in this. There's a handful of strategies, and each of them work, but they work with the right company and the right, like those two things have to marry up, right? Like what works for one company really really well may be the thing that the other company doesn't actually like, right? And so there is some of that where we've got to, we help clients and we navigate those discussions, and a lot of it is that decision making, saying like, well, is this something you want to bring in house? And if you're going to bring it in house, are you going to implement and provide the right amount of resource to it? If you don't want to do that, then let's look at outsourcing. And it's like, okay, but then you got to understand what's the second and third order effects of outsourcing. Like, can you live with those? Is that the trade-off that you want? And so comes down to ultimately decision making on whatever strategy is going to best fit your needs, and then accommodating the rest of it.
Yeah. All that to say, a surprising amount of network conversations lately, which is great. Like, I mean, those those are like challenging projects, which is like, you know, I and the rest of the team here, like we love digging into those. So, I mean, it's good. It's good business for us and very impactful for our clients. So, I guess that's top of mind on what's going on, mostly because I feel like every day this week I've been having multiple of those discussions, which is good stuff. So, we'll probably get back to some sexier technology, next week. But you know, that's solving business problems. It's not always about something that's flashy, right? Sometimes it
No,
is digging into the
brilliance,
weeds with things.
brilliance at the basics.
Absolutely.
Uh, that makes all the difference.
All right. I mean, that's
Oh,
really top of mind and what's going on with us. We'll be back right after this break. All right. Welcome back for our closing section here of the pod. And what we have been talking about and kind of what we've been doing with this section is really throwing it out there on how have you AI'd today, and really kind of the whole goal is just to you know introduce use cases, whether they're professional, personal, and talk about how it's impacting us. I'm a big believer right now, at least, and kind of where we're at in AI, just starting with an AI literate workforce is a good foundation, right? And so obviously that includes a lot of other components than just like how are you using it, things around like data structure, security, all of that stuff. But we've been having some fun with this section. So KG, I think it's your week, man. How have you AI today?
yeah. So, well, ironically, I used AI to help me with AI in the actual um, management of the licensing. Right. So I was using ChatGPT and how to manage some licensing, and I couldn't readily figure out like, hey, where do I go for this? So I just asked ChatGPT, like, hey, ChatGPT, where do I go in ChatGPT to manage my licenses or add or do a different configuration. So that was one that I had done that was a little bit ironic. Some of the other ones really are, gosh, I would try to bucket them into like this little, like a helper, right? Where it's little things throughout your day where you're like, man, what was that term, or what's the difference between this thing and that thing, in your in your professional environment. So like, what's the difference between, I think I was using like virtual ENV versus VENV, and so this is like a virtual environment thing. I couldn't really remember what the difference was, and I was getting the two confused. So instead of doing a bunch of Googling and figuring out, like, hey, what's the difference? And it gave me a quick, and it was like, oh yeah, that's it, right? So it saved me, those little things where I could do a quick prompt. It's up on one of my screens kind of throughout the day, and is that saving me 4 hours? No, but it probably saved me 2 minutes, right? And you do that 200 times, and all of a sudden, again, you start to create this use case of this little bit of a helper sitting over your shoulder that you can just constantly kind of ping, um, makes things more efficient, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's a solid kind of point, and even the way you use it there, where people are like, "AI is going to replace me." But like, no, like you have to know how to query it. Like you have to have the context to even be able to query it in there and get it back. I mean, I wouldn't have known what to query there, right? Like I'm not a software developer in the way you are. So it's interesting. I mean, I've been using it pretty impactfully. I was using it in like a much more creative way, where like creative, like not as compared to you, but in like some brainstorming I was going through around kind of some content and whatnot. But it was interesting. I walked through it all, and I had it in the format there, and I was like, man, I would love to like get this into a Word document, but not looking like it does, when you copy and paste it. And so had it converted all to HTML. First asked it how to do it. Then it told me, it's like, okay, well, have to ask me to convert this to HTML. Then you've got to save it as, uh, uh, in Notepad as a .txt, then open it in Word. Then it looks good. And then I was able to like easily get it into PowerPoint. Like all that stuff would have taken so long. And so, you know, even just in like some basic things like that, it's been nice. So
Yeah, but that right there, right? Like again, going back to your original point of like it didn't replace the human because you had the vision, right? Like you had, hey, I know what I want, which the computer doesn't. That's the piece that you're gonna need, at least for the foreseeable future, you're gonna need humans for, is that vision piece of saying like, hey, I have this idea, this concept of, whether it's an automation or a presentation that I want to build. Um, and then, hey, help me with the execution of this, or help me connect the dots here. And then that's where it can be really efficient, is like, well, these individual kind of problem sets have been solved, but then making it the sum of a new part, like that's where there's that kind of collaboration or synergy that can be really really powerful when you combine the human element with the AI element.
yeah, 100%. I mean, I go back to just the I mean, you and I end up talking about a lot, but I mean, I'm starting to talk to the whole team about it, right? Like being an AI literate workforce is just starting there, like as a foundational element, is I think important. And I don't, for those listeners who are in larger companies, like don't wait for some thing to be pushed down from corporate. Like work with your teams on it. Obviously you should also be figuring out the cyber components, the security components. You should understand hallucination. Like there are other things around it. I'm not just saying go play with this thing all the time on things that are work related. But like people should have personal management on how am I becoming AI literate, because it is like it just makes you more impactful.
Yeah, do you think it's the next and somewhat comparable, right? But when Excel first came out and people that learned how to use and leverage Excel, and it's like, well, that person became more valuable in an organization, right? This is a version of that where it's a competency as a worker. So not only does it make you more impactful in your work, but then if you develop that culture across your organization, like you can differentiate your culture and your workforce against your competitors, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, even today, like I I won't I hate using absolute statements here, but I won't hire someone that is not like very literate in the Microsoft suite, because we live in it all. We're knowledge workers. We live in it all day, every day. Like I've hired people who were coming from G Suite shops, and like I downplayed it at the time, but I've personally experienced now what it's
Yep.
like for someone that has been living in that to come into our organization and how heavy we drive it. I don't know what the time horizon is, if it's 3, 4, 5 years. I don't know what it is, right? But like there are going to be pieces where, you know, hiring managers are going to be looking for AI literate workforces. I absolutely believe that is the case. I mean, it's important to me. We're certainly not at the stage where like I'm looking at it in applicants and saying like, hey, this is a go no go type of thing. But I want curiosity there. I want people who see it as a strong possibility for them, and probably who have taken on some level of learning on their own. So
Yep.
um, I do think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks volumes, not just like, oh, hey, you learned how to use ChatGPT, but the idea that, hey, you learned, right? Like you were somebody
Yeah.
that had a level of curiosity. So it's not even just the fact that, oh, hey, ChatGPT or whatever AI version is individually valuable, but that type of person in your organization who says, hey, I'm forward leaning, I'm constantly learning, I'm able to pick up new things, I'm proactive in doing it, I took initiative, like all of those things to a hiring manager, like, or as an executive, it's like check check check, yes. Like
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
type of
Exactly.
people we want.
Exactly. Cool. Good stuff. Well, I guess we'll be back. I hope everyone enjoyed, and that's a wrap.